I know I told everyone that whichever tour you were doing for whichever community before, it clearly did not have anywhere near the numbers that you have with the Bushy community, because we love you, and we are so excited about having a little bit of joy and a little bit of um, of a VIP experience, especially in these extraordinary times. When in the past we've had the privilege of joining you in the various museums for your various tours, it's always been so well received, as everything you do for our community is. And it's just a pleasure for both of us to welcome you back yet again. Although we're only 2-3 minutes in to 8 o'clock, we already have 107 participants at separate screens that are on. Unbelievable. I guarantee you my shiurim get double that, but that might not be 100% true. So, no, you're on mute. You're on mute. You're on mute.
So never underestimate the power of a Christmas special.
No. Okay. So we're going to hand it over to you. Would you also just share a little bit regarding the philosophy behind this particular tour, and also in terms of interactions, how you would like to play it? I'll hand it over to you, but obviously we're here in the background for anything you need. So without further ado, creation of VIP tour through the Natural History Museum by our friend, Rabbi Dr. Raphy Zarum.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Elchanan and Jacqueline. I really look forward to being able to come to visit Bushy live. And it just amazes me how the rabbis and the Rebbitzins of all the communities are keeping everything going with what's going on with COVID. My own shul as well, it's so challenging. And, you know, I get low and I have difficulties, and the rabbis just keep going, keep being positive, and keep looking after us. It's an amazing thing. And you have a great Rabbi Rebbitzin to do that. So my love and support goes out to them. And they inspire me by always being so positive. And Jacqueline asked me to mention just briefly, there's another program that Jacqueline's going to be running, which is something I was involved in. It's called the Torah for Everyone, a Torah in a Nutshell course. It's a course for those who want to get a bit more into their Jewish learning, and Jacqueline's a great teacher of this. It's basically understanding how the Torah was put together, the structure of the deep structure of the entire Torah, and how to give a Devar Torah around your Shabbos table. So Jacqueline's going to be running that course. It's Torah La'am. I've got the last booklet over here of it. It's an entire course with this amazing program of learning how the Torah is put together, maps, and all this different kind of stuff to see how it works. If you want to know more about it, talk to Jacqueline, and she will tell you about it. But now let's do Natural History Museum. Let me just take you to the front entrance to start with, just to get a feel for it. Welcome, right? In London now, it's actually sunny. We are here right now, all of you. And this is the natural, we're standing at the steps. It's quite quiet, actually. So you can take your mask off because there's no one else around. It's just you and I at the Natural History Museum in London. Let's just look at it. Can I click on here? Yeah. Oh, let me just go out a bit. And let me just go down so you can actually see the size of this museum, because I want you to think about how it's been built. Just look at this, right? This is the museum coming from the front over here. Can I pan out a bit more? No, okay, let me do over here. Actually, you know what? If I turn around, I can actually maybe go further out. And then you can see it. Can I go? Yeah, I can go over here. That's good. Let me go and stand over here. See, look, there's buses going past. It's amazing how light it is at this time of the day in central London. Who knows? And look, this is the museum. Look at the left view. This whole museum. What does it remind you of? Now, since Elchanan, you asked, I would like people occasionally, if they can, to write in the chat if they want. So if the people out there listening, what kind of building does this remind you of? This is important for the tour. Right, there's a beautiful museum. You can enter from the front here. There's normally huge queues going up here onto the steps. What kind of building, do you want to write in the chat, does this remind you of? Right, if you know, look at this. This was built, this wasn't taken over, by the way. This was built to be the natural, those windows, to be the Natural History Museum. Don't speak, keep mute, but write in the chat. Let's have a look at what you got in the chat. Cathedral, church, cathedral, cathedral, cathedral. You are all spot on. It was built to look like a cathedral. And the question is, why? Why did they build it like this? Who built it? When did they build it? And more importantly, should us Jews feel comfortable inside? If this is talking about evolution and the ancient world going back millions of years and looking at dinosaur bones, should a religious Jew feel comfortable here? Should they walk through the doors? Well, let's go in. Come on, let's go in. Should we feel comfortable here? Is it a good thing to go to or not? Now let me look straight away at what's here. Look at this main hall. Again, looking like a cathedral. Right, look at the ceiling over here. Amazing ceiling with actually pictures of flowers and all different kind of flora and fauna from all over the world. See, on the ceiling over here. And on the walls are little animals climbing up. Let's see if I can show you that as well. Let's scroll over to here. It's an amazing advantage of being in this. Look, can you see these monkeys climbing to the top of the museum? Look at that. Isn't that amazing? It was built to be full of animals, right? And animal images and stones. And even on the stone on the corner here, you can see all different kinds of animals. So why did they build it like a cathedral? If it's meant to be a museum, natural history about science and evolution, why would they make it look like a church? And look at this guy in the middle of it. Okay, look at him here. This is the famous Dippy, Diplodocus carnegie, right? Incredible. So it's not a real dinosaur, it's a copy of one with his tail up here. And over here, if I go to the back, the guy who holds it all together. Now, I know when you look at him at first, he looks Jewish, right? Because he's got a nice big beard. But let's see if you can work out who he is. Let's go in close. Here he is. Nice big beard. Look very comfortable with the hat on the London Vet Din. But he's not. Who is this guy? Do you want to write in the chat who is him? Sitting there very calmly, looking over the entire museum. Who is it? There we go. Good. It is Charles Darwin. He unifies the museum. You've all heard of the theory of evolution, and I'm going to assume you know a little bit about it. But before him, because the museum predates him, before him, the museum was all different sections, right? It had the dinosaurs and the birds and the insects, all different creatures in different sections. They all work separately. With Darwin, they began to realize that it's all interconnected. How would I describe evolution as a Jew? You know what? All life is mishpacha. Right? What do you say when it's mishpacha? When you meet someone and say, oh, they're mishpacha, it means they're part of your family. So Darwin said, all life is mishpacha. All life is interconnected. And if you go back to very early in time, there's just a few basic forms which all of life comes from. That was Darwin's radical idea. Does that clash with the Torah about 7 days of creation? Does that mean that there is no God that didn't make this and it just happened randomly through random selection? Does Darwin challenge our faith? That's what this tour is going to be about as we investigate this amazing museum. And here's what you can do, what you can't do live, which is just stand on the floor and look straight up at the museum like this. You can do this, you can't do this. Look at it, and it really looks like, if I showed you that, you'd all think you're in a church. That's exactly what it is. So what's that about? We're going to answer those questions tonight. Okay, and feel free at any point to write something in the chat, and I'll feel free at any point to ignore it or answer it depending on where we're up to. Okay, that's a good deal. So let me show you my handout to start first of all. Here we go. Right, where does life come from? How old is the universe? Why are there no dinosaurs in the Torah? A joke that was always said to me, some guy said, you know what, in my synagogue, you go on the back row, it's full of dinosaurs. But I'm not going to say that. I would never say such a thing. But why are there no dinosaurs in the Torah? And does the first chapter of Genesis, creation in 6 days, contradict what we know from the Torah? Okay, and what's the purpose of that museum? So I begin with a pasuk from the Torah, the first line of the Torah. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The most dramatic, powerful statement of God being the ultimate creator. There's no lots of gods. There's no fighting, competing gods or magical things. God calmly, clearly creates the whole universe. So what does this museum show us? So there's many different theories in different cultures of where life comes from. Famously, on the Sistine Chapel, you've got this famous painting of God creating Adam and touching him and giving him life. Now look at this. I took this photo over here on the left here. This is in the Natural History Museum in New York City. Can you see what's going on? Right here, the great creator God, this is in the Vatican, so the Christians, they believe in God. God above is creating Adam. Okay? But in the Natural History Museum in New York, can you see it's a monkey on a tree, a gorilla, touching his finger to a human skeleton. In other words, saying, no, life doesn't come down from God. Life comes from earlier ape-like forms, and that humans evolved from earlier species, which were ape-like. Can you see? It's a rejection of the Christian idea or the religious idea of God creating. So this is antagonistic as a picture. Interestingly, the movie E.T., which the older people will remember in the 80s, about extraterrestrial life coming onto Earth. And again, Spielberg, the Jewish guy, uses the image, again from the Sistine Chapel, of this time alien touching human. And by the way, if you ask some modern scientists, where does life come from? believe it or not, some modern, very knowledgeable scientists think that life came from other planets, that we were seeded from aliens who gave life onto Earth. There's movies about this kind of thing. It's a crazy idea. Panspermia is the word for it, that the life was seeded from planets. But it makes you ask the question, where did those aliens come from? It doesn't really solve anything. And it's just as fantastical and unbelievable or as magical as the Torah. Right? In other words, thinking in terms of God, we have a belief in God. Why start thinking about all these magical, crazy ideas as well? So where does that come from? And the third and the fourth idea is this, right? I love the strategically placed laptop in this picture, but also this was a front cover of Time of a Nature magazine, and this is when they managed to make a basic cell. And they thought, they'd argued they were making life themselves. They weren't actually making life. What they were doing is using dead material and re-zapping it in order to re-spark it. It's more like a Frankenstein. It's not life from nothing. But these pictures show you the image of who can make life. Is God the maker of life, or can life come from other places? Okay. Are you all seeing this on the screen? I've got someone not saying they can't see this. Can you nod? Can you see this on the screen? Is this clear? It is clear. Okay, so I'm not sure what scrolls.
Can't see what you're showing.
Yeah, you can see.
Can't
Okay.
see. No, I can't see what you're showing.
So I don't know
Can't
what that
see
is.
what you're.
Can you see this picture over here? The man
No,
with a laptop.
I
What
can't
is
see
that? Well,
No,
I
I
think
can't see.
Speaker view, maybe.
I think everybody else can. So it might be your computer. I'm not sure what's going on with the Zoom. We can see. So maybe in the top right, go from gallery mode to what the other one is called, speaker mode.
Speaker view.
Speaker view. I'm sorry, but it's not me. So you can solve that. Sorry. I'm going to keep going. That's okay. So that's a basic issue. So we're going to investigate now. Let me look about where life comes. I don't want to make it too complicated. So let's look at the 7 days of creation. Right? Is that true? Does that make sense? And you probably think, well, Rabbi Zarum, it kind of works. You're going from simple to complicated creatures. You've got light and dark on day one, then heaven and earth, and then plants, and then sun, moon, and stars, then fish and birds and animals, and then Shabbat. That kind of makes sense with evolution, and it gets more complicated. Is that right? But you know what? There's a few problems with this. You know why? What came first, the sun or the earth? If we look historically, and this is what we know from the cosmological model, right? We can measure this because of our amazing telescopes. We can work out the age of the universe. The age of the universe we estimate to be 13.5 billion years, right? And the sun is about 5 billion years, and then 30 million years later, the earth comes along, right? Because after the initial Big Bang, gradually the planets start coming together, and the sun is 30 million years older than the earth. And then after the earth begins to form, another million years later, we get life on earth. So the sun, as I told you, is older than the earth. That's basic astronomy. When we look at the 7 days of creation, it seems to be wrong, God forbid. The earth is made on day 3. We have the land and plants and seas on day 3. And the sun's only made on day 4. It's a direct contradiction with science. Another problem, fish and birds and animals, right? Which came first, the fish or the animals? The birds or the animals? So yes, there were fish in the seas. Life did begin in the seas. That's true. But what about the birds? What's the oldest bird? That also is in the British Museum. Let me show you. It's on the next page. Here it is. This is a fossil. This is taken from the British Museum. It's upstairs, and I can't take you there anymore because the video doesn't take you there. But it's called the Archipetrix fossil. It's an amazing fossil. It's 147 million years old, which is more than the 6,000 of a creation, right? Right? And it's pronounced in Archipetrix. You can see over here, right? It's such a fundamental specimen that others have been compared to it. It was discovered in Germany in 1861, and it caused lots of confusion. Why? Because there were no birds that were known to be that old, millions of years old. Some thought it was not a bird, but an angel. Richard Owen, by the way, this museum superintendent, knew there was something extraordinary about it. Richard Owen, by the way, is he's the one who actually got the British Museum built, and he's the one who coined the word dinosaur. Very important guy in the history of the museum. And he investigated it and found out that Archipetrix was not like modern birds. It has feathers like a bird, but it has teeth, you can see over here, and claws and a bony tail like a dinosaur, right? Modern birds don't have that. And Owen was well famous for identifying animals, and he classified the Archipetrix as a bird, rejecting that it might be a reptile. right? The curious fossil was discovered just a few years later after Charles Darwin published his controversial theory. And Darwin's strongest supporter, Huxley, suggested that Archipetrix was actually a link between dinosaurs and birds. That's an attempt at looking at what the bird might have looked like. Can you see? So this is his head over here. So I'm going to get going a bit, right? This is his head over here. It's squashed in the stone, by the way. Remember how fossils work? An animal dies and it's got calcium in its bones. And as it decomposes, the calcium mixes with the local earth and turns into rock. And that rock becomes hard and leaves a shape in the ground. So fossils aren't really made of the animal, right? They're made of the calcium that's left, leaving an imprint in the stone. That's what's over here, okay? And you can see the shape of it with its wing down here and wings over here. This is an attempt of drawing what the Archipetrix bird might look like. It's got feathers, but also it's got teeth, which is unusual for a bird, and a kind of a hard top over here, right? And so the half bird, half dinosaur became central to the evolution debate. Until then, there were no intermediate forms or missing links between living animals and supposed ancestors. Although bird-like, it definitely had things that made it half like a dinosaur and half like a bird. So it made us realize that really there were dinosaurs first and only later were there birds. Do you know what that means? That means that this is also another contradiction. Birds came after animals. The first birds were dinosaurs that took flight, that grew wings, and that was their response to surviving, to fly. So ancient evolutionary biology argues that birds come after animals. So Bereshit's wrong there as well. It's wrong about the sun coming after the earth, and it's wrong about the birds coming before the animals. And a third problem, by the way, is about plants growing, okay? Because for plants to grow, what do they need? They need water and they need sunlight in order to grow. And if the sun only comes on day 4, how do the plants begin to grow on day 3? So all these questions have made, religious Jews who know their science say, well, the Torah doesn't fit. It's not in order. It's not in the right order. So what do we do about that? So there's a lots of answers to this issue. The basic issue is, why are you reading the Torah like a science book? It wasn't written to be a science book. It was written long before we knew a lot of this science. Okay, so the approach I'm going to give you, actually, let's look at these. Let's look over the page, actually. There's lots of approaches, but the approach I want to give you, which I quite like, is this. We don't say that there is concordism in this. We don't take every day of creation literally as it's written here. Because the Torah wasn't trying to describe to you what happened, it's trying to describe you ideas. But Maimonides even says very comfortably, all things were created together, but they were set out sequentially to distinguish them from each other. In other words, God's not describing to you what happened historically, God's describing to you the elements of creation laid out separately, okay? That's one example. Let me quote you from G.H. Hertz, previous chief rabbi. He said, look, now while the fact of creation has to this day remained the first articles of the Jewish creed, it's a religious commitment, mitzvah, to believe that God created the world. I read it you earlier. But nevertheless, he says, there is no uniform binding belief as to the manner of creation. It's a previous chief rabbi. There is no belief. You have to believe of how God did it. You have to believe that God did it, but how? Lots of ways. As to the process whereby the universe came into existence, the manner of the divine creative activity is presented in varying forms under many different metaphors by prophet, psalm, and sage, by the rabbis of the Talmud and medieval thinkers. You think the only version of creation is chapter 1 of Genesis, but look in Psalms, look in Proverbs. There's other versions of creation described differently. Each one is bringing you a different element of what God was doing. The Torah, as you know, is not a science book. It's a book of morality. It's a book of meaning. It's a book of how to live. And that's, in fact, what the Torah is doing. Let me give you an example of how that works. Why is it then in this order, right? Why are there 6 days? Well, what's happening is, one explanation, it's called the frameworks theory, which many have suggested, is that God creates 3 structures, light and dark. Okay, in other words, the idea of energy and light, then above and below, the heavens and the earth below, the heavens and the things below, and then land. And in those 3 frameworks, God then populates them with objects, right? So in the context of light and dark, God makes sun, moon, and stars. In the context of above and below, we have birds up above and fish down below. And in the context of the land, right, separated by the seas, we have animals on them. That's another framework example. That's why I've laid it out like this. Another theory is it's describing things as what's nearest to human beings. God knows ultimately God's going to make man, creation, human beings. And therefore, the nearest things to us are the animals made on the same day as us because we live near them. Then the next thing we have are the fish that are in the seas that we see and the birds. And then a bit above us are the sun, moon, and stars. It's created from the perspective of human beings. It's God is getting closer. First, long way away, sun, moon, and stars, then closer fish and birds, then ultimately animals themselves. So the order of creation is not a scientific order. It's not a historical order. It's a conceptual order. Right? And if that sounds complicated, imagine there's over 100 of you listening. I could line you up in order of age. I could also line you up in terms of height. I could line you up in terms of glasses wearers and how much you can see. And the order will always be different. I can order things in lots of ways, right? I can order it into how expensive your clothing is, right? And each time be a different order. Or how religiously learned you are, and have the Rabbi and Jacqueline at one end, right? And then a few of us at the other end, right? And there's all different ways of ordering. So Hashem's order is clearly not scientific. Why would it be? God's not trying to teach us science. That's what scientists are for. God's teaching us the relationship of life compared to man, what you need to know around you, the world around you. That's the way it's described here. That's the first thing I wanted to teach you, okay? Now, the next thing I want to teach you, and if you've got any questions on that point, I've simplified it a lot to make it clear for you. There's lots of other ideas here, but that's the basic idea. What I want to do now is ask another question, but if there's any chat questions, now's your chance to ask before we move to the next part, which is the famous bit all about dinosaurs, because people always want to know about dinosaurs. They're the most exciting part of the museum, and they're always very full. Let's go back to our Dippy over here. Before I get into dinosaurs, actually, before I do, let's just look on this sheet over here. You can see it's a very famous line by Stephen Jay Gould. Why do we like dinosaurs? Because they're big, they're scary, and thankfully for us, they're all dead. Okay, but why are there no dinosaurs in the Torah? Where are they? So let's first go back into our museum and let's look again at Dippy, at our dinosaur, right? And I want to show you now about how science changes and we learn a lot of information as it changes, because you can see over here. So, and by the way, I've cheated. By the way, this Dippy is not in the middle of the museum today. Okay, might look like he is, but there's something else that's there. We're going to see it later on. But thankfully, I can show you different versions of the museum because online it's got the old, the new versions. But let's look at him over here. Isn't he amazing? Look how long he is, right? I think it's nearly 70 foot long. He is called Diplodocus carnegie. And for anyone who does fundraising, you can probably guess why he's called Diplodocus carnegie. Here's the story. In 1902, King Edward VII was in Pittsburgh. The King of England was visiting in Pittsburgh, right? The Carnegie Museum, which was paid for and built by Andrew Carnegie, the industrialist. And there is an 80-foot-long Diplodocus carnegie. And King Edward turned to Andrew in a light lunch and said, it would be so wonderful if we had something like this in our museum in London, hint, hint. And Carnegie knew what he had to do. And within 3 years, weighing 15 tons, they shipped over a copy of Diplodocus carnegie. And this is him over here, right? He got named Dippy for short. And you can see his head over here. He's actually on tour at the moment. He's not in the museum. He's going, oh, it's not sharpened. It's sharpening, yes. Yeah, let's see if I can home in on him. Yeah. Here's his head. You see over here? Isn't he beautiful? Again, this is a copy. This is not, remember, the fossils would be made of rock in the ground. As I told you, the calcium of the bones decomposes, mixing with the local sediments, it turns into rock. So fossils are rocks, and rocks would not hold up here, right? This is a copy, a plaster copy held up here. You can see his head over here, and the long neck, and his body moving along, and then his tail, his vertebra over here, and his legs, his huge muscles. Look at those muscles, and then his long tail over here. And as a result, you can kind of go over here and stand underneath the tail, right? Now, you know what? If you'd visited the museum in 1993, you would not have been able to stand under the tail. You know why? Because until 1993, that tail trailed along the ground. Because evolutionary biologists used to think that dinosaurs were plodding creatures and dragged their tails along the ground because they were so heavy. But you know what? They did research. They continued their research, and they looked especially at the footprints of the dinosaurs and the size of their muscles. And by looking at the indentations in the muscles, right, can you see over here? They could work out in the bones, they can work out what the shape of the muscles must have been. We know what human muscles look like, and just by the shape of the bone, you can work out the size of the muscles and therefore calculate the weight of it. And when they looked at the footprints that were in the ground, and they found footprints, not just in Jurassic, part of the movie, there's actual real footprints of dinosaurs, they should have been much deeper than they were. Well, occasionally the footprints were very deep when the dinosaurs stood still, but when it was moving, the impressions in the ground weren't as deep as they'd expected for the weight. You know why? Because it was moving at a pace. And they realized that in fact, Dippy was actually quite light on its feet, and the neck and the tail acted as a cantilever balance, and it moved quite fast, faster than some humans could run. And they worked all this out just by looking at, and if you visit the museum, there's all these pictures and video machines, and you can watch how they discovered that this Dippy actually, the tail wasn't on the ground. And that's why in 1993, they raised the tail. Okay, there's another reason I'm very joking about why they did it. I can go over here and I'll show you. There's in the back of the museum, and as a member, I've got to see it, there's room 1. And in room 1 are boxes of spare parts of all the creatures. And there's lots of spare parts of the tail of Dippy. Can you see him over here? I'll do it over here. Can you see the tail coming up here? Because when it trailed on the ground, people from other countries, not saying where, America, used to nick the end of Dippy's tail as a memento and take it home. So in room 1 in the back of the museum, there were like spares, said Dippy tail spares, and they always had to kind of fix it on. Right? They didn't raise it in 93 because of that, although some will think they did. I've read all this in my books about the museum. The reason they did it is because they realized, as I told you, that in fact Dippy was light on his feet, which means we can now look at him from the underside, which is what animals running away from him would have. There were no humans around at the time of Dippy, but that's what they would have seen. It's an amazing thing to see. Okay, so that's just a little bit about this incredible dinosaur. And dinosaurs can be discovered on every continent all over the earth. I do not believe that God planted them on the earth to trick us, and they weren't real, and the God just made it look like that. You know why? Because every morning when I daven before the Amida, I say Emet Bemunahu. God is truth, and the God of truth wouldn't lie to us. Why would God do that? Make it look as if it's older than it is, right? There are some religious opinions that think that, but I think it doesn't work at all. I think there were dinosaurs millions of years ago, but they died out, right? In fact, I asked my daughter once. Right? I said to her, do you think there were dinosaurs on the Ark? Right? Because there's this great cartoon. I don't know if you've seen it. There's this great cartoon that shows 2 dinosaurs on a little mountain with water all around, and the Ark, Noah's Ark, floating in the distance. And one dinosaur turns to the other and goes, "Was that today?" Damn. Right? And that's why they got died out. So I said to my daughter, were there dinosaurs on the Ark? And she goes, don't be silly, Abba. Of course, they were wiped out millions of years ago. So in her mind, there was no contradiction. But where are there dinosaurs in the Torah? Where are there? So let me show you my theory of where the dinosaurs are. We have to look at creation. Okay? Besides human beings, are any species actually described by name in creation? Right? There are no gefilte fish in creation, or salmon, unbelievably. And there's no chickens in creation. It just says animals, behemah, chaya. But there is one animal that is mentioned. This is on day 5 when God made the fish and the birds. What does it say? This is day 5, Genesis chapter 1, verse 20. Let the water be filled with all kinds of creatures. Chaya is life, living life. And birds will fly in the sky, up in Arakia, on the face of the heavens. That's what God said. God always says what God's going to do. Vayomer, God speaks, then God creates. Vayivra Elokim et hataninim hagadolim. Can you see this here? Look at the words. Hataninim hagadolim. God made the great taninim. Gadol is great. Right? And all the creatures that swarm in the sea. Leminihem, according to their kind. So he made the taninim and all the creatures that swim in the sea. But call off kanaf, but call off kanaf leminehu, and every kind of winged bird. And God saw v'yalakim kitov. God saw that it was good. So can you see? God made the fish and the birds, but it names a particular species, the great taninim. Some people think those are dinosaurs, and that's what the Torah is referring to. But I say no, they're not dinosaurs. You know why? Can anybody think why? Where did the Taninim live? Look, read the verse. And God created the Taninim and every kind of living creature in the water, and then every bird in the sky. Yes, as he said, God said, let fill the water and then birds in the sky. So Taninim are clearly aquatic. Can you see that? Because it's described to us, they can't be. Now, there were some dinosaurs in the water, but the vast majority were on land. So it doesn't make sense. So what are the translation? Hertz calls them sea monsters. Art Scroll calls them sea giants. Jerusalem Bible calls them crocodiles. Elsewhere, remember when Moshe chucks his stake on his staff on the ground? It turns into a tanin, some kind of serpent, slithering creature from the sea. So what is it? Let's look at the chat over here. Right. Lee cast the story of Yonah. I don't know what you're asking there, but are you talking about the great fish from Yonah? Yes, we'll get to that. So in Yonah, it's called Dag Gadol. It's just called the great fish. It's not called Taninim. Okay. There is a kind of magical creature called the Leviathan, which some people think that it is. But clearly, as I told you, majority are land animals. So the question is, why does the Torah bother to mention just one creature, which is not just the Taninim, the great Taninim? So there's lots of serpents or great fishy creatures. What are the really big ones? What are the biggest creatures on the planet? Anybody know? It's not the dinosaur. It's not. Shall I show you what it is? I'll show you what it is. It's not the dinosaur. Let's go back into the museum and let's change rooms. Let's go over here. We're now in the mammal section. Here's a giraffe. Okay, actual size, by the way. Okay, so imagine you're a human being standing here. There's a little stand. You'd be the height over here. This is your height. So this is the giraffe. There's an elephant. There's a hippopotamus. Okay, so you're standing here. You can see how large they are. Okay, you see how big those are? Right, now, this is the edge of a blue whale. And this is relative sizes. Okay, you ready? Now, that is an elephant, that's a giraffe, and this is a majestic blue whale. Unbelievable. Just look how big it is. Just look, guys. Right, there's even a hippopotamus over there just to compare. Look at it. Right, this is a copy of a whale that washed up on the beach, and they made it out. This is made out of wood. A blue whale. Right, the largest creatures. Okay, larger than the largest dinosaur. And more to the point, they're still around. Why would the Torah describe creatures that died out millions of years before humans were on planet Earth? The Torah is written for human beings. Why describe a creature that you would never see? No, the Taninim are the great blue whale, the great sea creatures. When you looked out from land, you would see them, right? So the Ramban says, there's a traditional commentaries, God even made the great, powerful, wondrous sea monsters. Why is it mentioned by name? Imagine you want to say God did everything. God made everything from A to Z. All creatures, great and small. So what does it describe? Look, the great Taninim and every living creature that swarms, even the small ones on the earth, it's going from big to small. So the biggest creature, no, because it can't go small, because ultimately they'll be smaller than the human eye. So it just mentions that God made even the biggest creature you can see with your eyes today, not a dinosaur, which isn't the biggest anyway, by the way, we know that. You look it up, by the way, the largest creatures are the blue whales. Even larger than any dinosaur, and they're still around for humans to see. That's why the Torah mentions them, that God even made those. And you'll say, Raphy, but that's wrong. Whales are mammals. They breathe. They come up. They're not fish. You're right, but the Torah is not describing things biologically. It's describing things, as I showed you earlier, by location. Land, sky animals, land animals, and sea animals. Whales are mammals, but they live in the sea. The Torah is therefore describing it as a sea creature. That's why it's there. And they're the largest ones. That's what the Ramban says. Okay? And look what he says. And God created the great Taninim because of the great size of these creatures, some consisting of many Persian miles. Whoa. The Greeks in their books even relate that they knew some of them to be 500 Persian miles long. And others, like I spoke of them in magnifying terms. On account of that, the Torah explicitly describes. God describes them. Now, were they that big? What's Ramban talking about? So I had to read a lot to understand this. It's very interesting. Right? Remember, in those times, people didn't swim. They didn't go far out and see whales. They would only see them from ships at a distance. And the whales often, I'm sure you all watch the Great David Attenborough programs, right? From a distance, what you see, whales, families of them, all swimming, all their families in the water. Now, you and I now know it's a whole bunch of them. But from a distance, you just see this, and then this, and then this. So I'm looking at the screen, I'm going to look at it. See this, oh my God, yeah, this, and then this. And you know it's 3 different whales or a whale going through the water. From a distance, they thought it was one creature that was very long and was miles long. That's what the Ramban is describing. They thought there were many miles long, these creatures. They thought they were huge. They are huge, but not as big as they thought. By the way, whales are amazing creatures. Just read Moby Dick. It's not an action movie. It's a movie about the nature of humankind. Where does the whale's head begin and tail, head end and tail begin? Okay, whales are a meter between one eye and the other. They don't see, their eyes don't join together. They see 2 different worlds together. Some of them live to over 200 years. Right? We know that because they found spears in them that are that old. Right? It's amazing things. So whales are literally magnificent creatures. And even HaKadosh Baruch Hu made those. That's the greatest one. That's why there's no dinosaurs in the Torah. Because why would there be? They're not around when the Torah is given to the Bnei Israel. Why would God describe that? Why do we need to know that? It wouldn't be years till we found dinosaur bones. Much more relevant is the greatest creature ever, which is still around for humans to see, and that is the whale. And Roberto Cassuto, who was the chief rabbi of Florence and went on Aliyah and became professor at Hebrew University in the year before the war, Hebrew University in Jerusalem, he writes a brilliant commentary on creation. It's in Italian, it got translated, and this is what he says, and it's so brilliant. He says, in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in the land of Canaan, and in countless countries of the East generally, all sorts of legends used to be recounted about the battles of the great gods against the sea dragon and similar monsters. That's what other people believed in, the Tahom monster. They believed that the world came out of lots of creatures and gods fighting each other. And this is what Cassuto then says. He says, the Torah is entirely opposed to these myths. It voices its protests in a quiet manner, relating, so God, you think that the monsters fought? No, God created the great sea monsters. It's as though the Torah in effect is saying, far be it from anyone to suppose that the sea monsters were mythological beings opposed to God or in revolt against God. They were as natural as the rest of the creatures and were formed in their proper time, in the proper place, by the word of our Creator, our Kadosh Baruch Hu, in order that they might fulfill his will like all other creatures. Cassuto is telling you that chapter 1 of Genesis is a direct rejection of idolatry. People worship the sun. No, 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 no. God made the sun. People worship the moon. No, 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 no. God made the moon. People worshipped the abyss and great sea creatures. No, 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 no. God made those things. Genesis chapter 1 literally demythologizes. It takes all this magical mythology and says, no, they're all physical objects. They're not really gods. The one true God who created everything in harmony created all these things. They're all subservient underneath the one true God. That's what Genesis 1 is describing to us. And that's why the sea creatures are mentioned, just to show that they weren't mythical beings. Now, the rabbi said, I've got to keep things general and light, and I'm going to, but I think you guys are smart in terms of an idea that I think you want to know, which is, where did dinosaurs come in the Torah? There is one example, and I'm going to explain this idea, and then Rob, you can tell me if you think this was appropriate. I think it is, because it's so clever, it's not my idea, that it will explain to you brilliant ideas, and I think you'll love it, okay? So here's my idea, but I hope it's not too complicated. Here we go, right? I've told you dinosaurs. Richard, 1842, Richard Owen, paleontologist, calls them dinosaur, Dinosaurus, terrible lizards, okay? But where were they first found, okay? And they lived 160 million years ago, long before humans. But humans only go back 100,000 years, Homo sapiens. So they were long well before us. But where were the first dinosaurs found? And look at this. As early as, I'm going to read this. This is from a little book called A Very Short Introduction to Dinosaurs. It's very short. So I figured if it's a very short introduction, I can do it with you. Look what he says. I'll read it slowly. It's so brilliant. Once you get the idea, it'll change your life. As early as the 7th century BC, that's 2,700 years ago, the Greeks had contact with cultures in Asia. Remember the Greeks in Rome and moving over? Remember you had Alexander the Great conquering the known world, going all the way to Asia, right? And there are written accounts at the time, there's in the histories and so on, in Greek writings, of a griffin. Remember, there used to be a bank. I think you came off the time. There used to be a Midland Bank. The old members will know where the logo of the Midland Bank was a griffin, okay, which is a kind of dragon, a griffon, a creature that reputedly hoarded and jealously guarded gold. You know, like in The Hobbit, dragons guard their gold. This is a griffin over here. See a kind of a winged creature, right? It was wolf size with a beak, 4 legs, sharp claws. Further right, that's the mythology of this creature that guarded gold. Okay, and they all talk about these magical creatures that guarded the gold. Now, where did that come from? Right. Furthermore, the Near East art of the 3rd century BC depicts griffin-like creatures. The griffin myth about these dragons that guarded their gold, which eventually Tolkien wrote about in The Hobbit, and there's many stories of dragons guarding gold in mythology. The griffin myth arose in Mongolia, China, in association with the ancient caravan routes and gold prospecting in the Tian and outlying mountains. People would go east to discover gold caravan routes, and those stories came from there. This is part of the world. Now, look what the guy says. He says a brilliant thing. He says, this part of the world we now know is rich in the fossil heritage and is notable for the abundance of well-preserved dinosaur skeletons. They are remarkably easy to find because their white fossil bones stand out clear, soft against the red sandstone in which they're buried. Okay? Now, do you get that? So imagine when they were prospectors hunting gold, they would walk along these routes and they would see dinosaur bones. This is over 2,000 years ago. What did they think they were seeing when they saw these huge bones? They knew what human bones look like, right? And the radius and the ulnar and the fibula and the tibia and the legs. And they saw bones that were like, I'm trying to get on the camera here, over here, right? They were this big, 10 times bigger. So thinking, well, if human bones are this big and the humans are this big, but if I see a bone that's that big, how big must the creature be that lived with that bone? Now look what he says. Of even greater interest is the fact that the most abundant of the dinosaurs preserved in this region is the Protoceratops. This was discovered hundreds of years later. They dug them up, they pieced them together, and they're Protoceratops, which are wolf-sized, have a prominent hooked beak and 4 legs terminated by sharp claws. Their skulls also bear striking upsweep bony fills, which might easily look like a griffin. That's the Triceratops, that's the griffin. And look what he says. It would appear to be highly probable that the griffin owes its origin to genuine observations of dinosaur skeletons made by nomadic travelers through Mongolia. And here's an example, right, of examples of Triceratops at the British Museum. Did you get that? Let me summarize it to you, basically. Here's the idea, right? The people saw, when they were walking far east, bones. And they saw bones of huge creatures, and they imagined huge dragons that protected the gold they were going to hunt. And they wrote stories about them, and mythologies came about them. And people wrote about these things a long time ago, for many, many years. Then the Torah comes along and says, no, 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 that mythology is not true. God created those things. And then thousands of years later, biologists come along and say, those aren't dragons. They're real dinosaur bones. It's a misunderstanding. So the Torah already rejected them as mythology.
Dinosaurs now, yeah.
Please be on silence, please. I can mute you over here. Yeah. But at the same time, the Torah rejected it, saying it's not mythology, God created it. And then modern biology comes along and says, no, they weren't mythical creatures. They were real dinosaurs. Do you follow all that? That's the hardest bit on the Torah. But it's just so brilliant. You understand how we got confused by these things. So now we know that mythology is not true. There were no dragons. The Hobbit is a great 9-hour adventure movie that I have watched. It is beautiful, right? But it's mythical. It's not real, right? God created the world, everything in its place. And the greatest creature is the blue whale. And that's why we describe it in our Torah. Now, any more questions? That's the second thing I wanted to teach you about the whales. So we've done the whales, and we've done the 7 days of creation. Any questions? Should we keep going? Do you want to do more? Let's do some more. Let's do a little history of the museum, because you've already noticed that it looks remarkably like a church, right? And let's work out why, right? So, a selective history of the museum. Look at this, so interesting. Lots of lovely pictures you to see. In 1753, Sir Hans Sloane left his private collection to the nation. Remember, in those days, there were, people didn't go to university, only educated gentlemen could study, and he was a naturalist. That's not a naturist, that's something else. We don't do naturism, but we do naturalism. That's the old word for biologist, okay? And he gave all his objects to the museum, to the British Empire to look after. And so what did they do? The British Museum was set up by royal assent to house Sloane's things. Do you know how they raised money? Can you see this? This is the first ever lottery ticket. The original lottery was to raise money for the British Museum. Right? By the way, the Natural History Museum we're going to talk about came from the British Museum. That's why I'm describing the British Museum to you. Okay? Oh, Claude, you're asking about time. We'll come back to that, Claude. And ask that question later, Claude. We might answer that. Okay. So yes. So that's the story over here. 1759. They start raising money for the British Museum, and then in 1771, and this is very important because now, right, thanks to the great British ships, we are now circumnavigating the globe. Right, if you want to see a great right about that, right? So James Cook, you've all heard of him, returns from his epic 3-year circumnavigation of the world, and there's a quote now from the time, laden with the greatest treasure of natural history that ever was brought into any country at one time. No fewer than 1,400 new species from around the earth, more than 1,000 new species of animals, 200 fish and assorted mollusks, insects, and maritime creatures. And by the way, in those times, the British Museum was both the British Museum and the Natural History Museum was all one. It wasn't separate, right? So all the ancient works of humans, you know, and the Assyrians, Babylonians, and the Egyptians was all mixed up with lots of creatures and dinosaur bones and everything else. Okay, and when Cook turned up, imagine if you were a researcher in the museum and you were told Cook's arrived at the port, and you run to the port and you watch this stuff being unloaded, and you think, I've got work for the rest of my life, classifying all these species, understanding all creations that God has made, all these wonderful things. And I say God's creations because in those times they were all firm. They were good, devout Christians. They believed that God made all these things. Okay, so they started investigating them. In 1802, William Paley writes an amazing book called Natural Theology, or Evidence of the Existence and Attributes of the Deity, that's God, in the Appearance of Nature. He does the famous watchmaker analogy. You walk along in a forest and you see a watch, right? Not a phone, a watch, right? For the younger people, you might know what a watch is. A watch is a physical way of counting time. It's not electronic. It's got no buttons, right? It's actually a mechanical piece, right? Put together, which clicks and counts time. Ask your parents, they'll show you one, okay? It's a watch. So, by the way, this is a pen, right? It's a real physical thing. It looks like I'm sarcastic. Right. So what's the watchmaker analogy? In the forest, you walk along and you see a watch, a real watch, lying on the ground. Do you think bits of metal fell together and magically turn up in this watch? No. Somebody put it there. Why? It's too complicated to have just fallen together. That's Paley's argument for God making the world. If you look at the human eye, it's so complicated and just right that the reflection of light goes on our retina. We can convert it to light patterns and understand what it's saying. It can't be that just happened. It must have been that someone made it, and that someone is HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is God who made the earth. And that was standard reading in the 19th century in universities all over the country. Okay, in 1811, Mary Anning, the first lady of fossils. Let's see if we can find her in the museum. Okay, she was in Lyme Regis. Not such an exotic place, but I want to show you this because it wasn't just men who did this excavations. Where do we find it? Let's go back to the museum, and we have to go, let's get this right. No, that's dinosaurs that way. You guys, we want to go this way. Okay, let's go in the museum because I want to, right, let's go into this corridor along here. And on the wall are lots of dinosaur bones, but the dinosaurs of the seas that they found. Let's see, go along here. Look at the museum. So that's the insects over there. You can see the insect bit. Nice, the big beetle up there, a bit scary. Let's go further along here. Right, and you can see on the wall here, the Paleosauruses. Okay. Right, here we go. Let's go and stand. This X marks the spot. Let me turn around. You see all these creatures? This is what she found. And that's why there's a picture of it. Look, oh, look at that. Look at that. Look at that creature. Right, right. The humans stand up to this height of it. Look at it. Look at these three sea creatures. Here she is. Mary Anning, the first fossil woman, okay, in Dorset. When she was walking on the coast, she saw parts of a fossil skull sticking out of the cliff. Over the following months, she carefully uncovered an almost complete skeleton. This was the first specimen called the ichthyosaur, a fast marine predator shaped like a dolphin. It lived 195 million years ago. Okay, and that's a picture of Mary Ann over here doing this. By the way, when you visit the museum, they sometimes have an actress dressed up as Mary Ann, Mary Anning, and she would talk to the children about the things that she'd found in character. It's really wonderful, by the way, and it brings to life because people think it was all men that did this stuff, but actually there's women involved in this as well. Here she is, and there's her little dog called Rusty. by her side. And the little, look, she's pointing at the bone, the dinosaur that she's found. Right? So this was the great age of discovery where people were finding things and bringing them and writing articles about them. Isn't that an amazing period? Let's keep going historically. 1831, young Charles Darwin embarks on a 5-year journey on the HMS Beagle as the resident naturalist. So the boat was traveling around the Earth. Darwin had been in university, but he had this opportunity to see nature in its original form. And he spends 5 years traveling around the world. If you want to see a wonderful movie that kind of describes that kind of thing, there's a wonderful one called Master and Commander, Journey to the Far Side of the World. It's a wonderful example of a boat going all over the Earth and a naturalist on board who's basically playing the kind of Darwin character and discovering all these wonderful species. Meanwhile, so Darwin is seeing all these things and he's thinking, well, I've read my Torah, or Old Testament he would call it, which says God made all these things, and yet I'm discovering fascinating things. On different continents, I'm seeing similarities, right? And how could they be on different continents, things that are so similar when you couldn't get from one to the other? Did God make all these separately, or are they somehow connected? Okay. Oh, really? Oh, so David and Michelle Vogel are telling me there's a film next year with Nicole Kidman about Mary Anning. Fantastic. Thank you for telling me that. I look forward to seeing it in the cinema. Okay. Now, 1833, Sir Charles Lyell, foremost geologist of his day, completes his Principles of Geology, showing how the Earth was shaped entirely by slow-moving forces over a very long period, right? The first area that challenged the Torah wasn't biology, it was geology, right? It was geology, because Lyell worked out that if you look at the White Cliffs of Dover and the rocks and the gradual wearing down of the rocks, he realized that actually the Earth isn't thousands of years old like the Torah says, but it must be millions of years old, because they work it out from the gradual eroding and they work backwards. It must be millions of years old. And he writes a book called Principles of Geology, volume 1, published 1833, and Darwin's father sends it to him by mail and it gets to the Beagle and Darwin reads this. Now, why is that important? Because Darwin is beginning to think of maybe animals were connected to each other and evolved over time. The problem is it's incrementally slow. And he says, I need millions of years for this to happen. The Earth isn't that old. And then Lyell's book turns up, which says that the Earth is probably millions of years old. And Darwin thinks, oh, maybe there is something called evolution. I'm simplifying this a lot for you, by the way. Okay, that's the basic idea. Darwin gets back in 1836. He's visited all over the Earth, and he's puzzled by the geographical distribution of wildlife and fossils he's seen, right? And the similarity of all these species. Let me explain to you evolution just with one picture. It's on the next page here before I go back into this. It's this. And this is what I want to say. Now, what I'm going to say now might sound very negative about the Torah, but I'm saying this to point out to you. This is the arm of a frog. This is the arm of a lizard. This is the wing of a bird. This is the arm of a human, a cat, and a whale. By the way, for the whale, let's just go back to our whale from over here. Is he over here? Yeah. Look at the fin. That's a fin, right? There's bones inside that fin. Now, the fin is made in order to push through water, not to walk, right? Whales don't hold anything. They swim. So if you were a designer of a whale, what bones would you put in the fin? Think about that when I now show you this again. This is the whale fin. And it has a humerus, an ulna, a radius, carpals and metacarpals, just like a human. Small and fatter, but exactly the same formation. The bird wing has a humerus, ulna, radius, carpals, metacarpals. Why would a creature of the air, a creature of the sea, a creature of the land, cat, human, lizard, frog, remember the bat in the sky as well, also similar, all have the same basic structure? If you were building an airplane and a car and a submarine or a boat, would you do the same basic structure? That's crazy. That's stupid. Why do they all have the same structure? If HaKadosh Baruch Hu did this, chas v'shalom, I say this, Lavdil, I don't mean it, it's not very well made. It's not very well made. Why would you make it like this? But if they're all interrelated, it makes much more sense. Darwin understood that the basic structure of the forms in nature are so similar, it's too much of a coincidence that it wouldn't be for a reason. They're all interrelated. One comes from the other through millions of years of change. Okay, it takes millions of years. I'll give you one example of this, and then we'll move on from this. Let me choose an example of evolution. Let's choose ducks, because ducks are quite funny. Okay, I want you to imagine Mr. and Mrs. Duck, and they have 12 little ducklings. And then each of those ducklings meets another Mrs. Duck or Mr. Duck, and they have 12 more ducklings. How many ducklings are there after just 10 or 20 processes? Billions of them. In fact, the weight of those ducklings is more than planet Earth. So why is the Earth not overrun with ducklings? Because most of them don't survive to reproduce because of nature being red in tooth and claw, because they get eaten by other species. Only very few ducklings survive. They're being chased by predators in the water. And if they can swim fast and get away, they survive. And a few reproduce. And therefore the duckling population is kept in check by all other species, keeping each other in check. Now, when a duckling is born, they don't all look the same. They're all slightly different. And imagine, Darwin says, one duckling baby is born and its webbed foot is slightly more webbed than its brothers and sisters. It's just got a bigger, thicker web. And the result is that when it pushes in the water, it can go faster. And when it gets chased by crocodiles and by birds of prey coming down, it pushes ahead of the pack and survives. Unlike its brothers, it's got a mutation which happened randomly in birth, which is useful for its survival, a useful mutation. And as a result, when it gives birth to its babies, because it survives, it passes on that mutation of a slightly bigger web to its child. Go through millions of years and you can imagine that ducks' webs, feet got bigger and bigger. And that's the evolution of ducks. Meanwhile, birds evolve and all different species gradually evolve as they have random mutations in birth. Some of them are not very useful, right? Like you've got belly buttons as yours an innie or an outie, not very useful, no evolutionary advantage. But some things are advantageous and therefore they get passed on to the next generation. And that's how evolution works. That's what Darwin's theory says in very, very brief terminology. But Darwin's theory doesn't need humans. And that's the question, where are humans? So it doesn't need God in this, it just happens on its own. So we have to understand that issue. This is Darwin in drawing, by the way, in his diary over here. You can see he's seeing how the tree of life works. One thing evolves to another. And look what he says. He writes this in his book. There is no obvious reason why the principles which have acted so efficiently, sorry, I'll do the next thing. He says more individuals are born that can possibly survive. A grain in the balance will determine which will live and which will die, which variety will increase and which will decrease. The slightest advantage in one being at any age, right, could turn the balance. I love that phrase, who will live and who will die. What does it remind you of? Anybody recognize? Mi yichyeh u'mi yamut. We said on Rosh Hashanah in the Tana Tokef, who will live and who will die. That's an appealing to nature. We say, who by plague? We appeal to the biology of the world and say, what's going to happen to us? Just as Darwin said, how evolution works. That's why, because remember, Rosh Hashanah is the birth, remember the creation of the world and the birth of Adam. That's why in my box in Shul, I have a copy of Darwin's Origin of Species that I keep there on Rosh Hashanah. Because when I remember God creating the world and human beings, I remember this is how God did it through evolution. But I'll explain to you how that works in a minute. Let's go back to the History Museum and then we'll come back to evolution. Okay, those are the two things we want to do before we end. So just to tell you, let's go back to our history. Here's Darwin over here. Yes. So let me just explain this more clearly. Yes, just very briefly. I won't do all this. We have all creatures great and small. I don't want to do that. I want to show you that in 1859, Darwin publishes his book, Origin of Species. Sorry, I'm working it. Yeah. Okay. So it's the cleaners coming to clean the building. It's quite late here. Anyway, so here's what happens. Yes. Okay. Sorry. That's my phone ringing, telling me to remind me to take my pill. I'll take it later. Please remind me at the end to take my pills. Okay, right. So in 1859, Darwin publishes Origin of Species. It takes him many years. So he only publishes 1859, even though he came back from the journey 1836. He is very conscious people are going to be upset with what he writes. He doesn't mention humans anywhere. He doesn't mention humans. He only talks about other species evolving one to another. Right? And people are quite shocked by what he's writing, but the book gets published. In 1870, the British Museum still houses everything from natural biology also to history of human beings, you know, and Babylonian, Assyrian, all that kind of stuff. And what happens? Sir Richard Owen, there's a picture of him over here, gets up in that House of Parliament and he says the following. He says, we need to separate the works of God from the works of man. Just think how religious these people were. in Parliament. What's the works of God? That's natural history. That's the dinosaurs and the whales and all this kind of stuff. And the works of man is Babylonian history, the Assyrians, the Greeks, the Egyptian hieroglyphics and the mummies and all that kind of stuff. That's how he decides it. The British Museum is the works of man. The Natural History Museum, said by Sir Richard Owen, right, was the works of God. Meanwhile, Darwin publishes a second book, The Descent of Man, which talks about humans evolving as well. So all this is happening at the same time. Then what happens in 1881? The Natural History Museum is built in Kensington, the one that you saw earlier. And Owen is the director. It's built by Alfred Waterhouse. And he designed it as a temple to nature. Now you get it. Look at this. It was described in 1951. The Natural History Museum is described as a Gothic building that gives the visitor the impression that the zoo has escaped from Regent's Park and taken refuge in a cathedral. It's meant to be a church because it's an ode to God. These are the creatures that God has created. Yes, today it's run by secular scientists who are trying to explain biology and won't talk about God. They might be religious, they might not be, but they park their religion at the door and they do scientific research. But the builders of the museum believed in God, that God made all these species. That's why I feel so comfortable in the museum. The people that built it, they were Christian, but they believed in the creator just like I did. And they built this museum to look at the wonders of Maaseh Bereshit, the wonders of the creation of the world. So of course we should feel comfortable here. The people that built it believed like we did in Hashem, the creator. Of course it's a beautiful place. That's what it is. It's a holy space. It's recognizing God's creation in nature. And by the way, to celebrate the 200th anniversary of Darwin in 2008, right? So what happened is Owen, remember I showed you where Darwin is sitting in the center of the museum. Let me go back to that. Over here. Remember I showed you earlier, no, we went out there. Let's go back along here, by the way. Remember let's go back along here. Remember I showed you that Darwin is sitting along over here, right? So originally Darwin wasn't there. The person that got the museum built was Richard Owen. So Richard Owen's statue was over here. Darwin was in the cafeteria down here, right? And I used to visit. I know Darwin was in the cafeteria. Owen was in the center here because he's the one who was responsible for convincing Parliament to build it. But what happened in 2008, to celebrate the anniversary, and because the new atheists had more power now, they moved Owen to another place and Darwin was put onto the main landing. It took 3 days to do it. There's a video on YouTube of Darwin being plonked in the middle there. So you see the history of the museum is bound up with these debates about religion and science. Very interesting. Okay, but I want to go back now on the last bit. So that's about the museum and its origins. I want to go back now to a little bit more about evolution, and then I'll take your questions. Okay, so over here, yes. This is the last paragraph of Darwin's original book on the origin of species. This is the last. The word evolution only occurs once. It's the very last word. It says the following: thus, from the war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object which we are capable of conceiving, namely the production of the higher animals, follows. He says there is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone on cycling according to fixed laws of gravity, from so simple a being, endless forms, most beautiful and wonderful, have been and are being evolved. Darwin says, Darwin's book is not called The Origin of Life. It's called The Origin of Species. Darwin says, I don't know how life began. And I'll show you a quote what he says later. I don't know how life began, but once we had the basic beginning of life, I can tell you how it evolved and got more complicated. So we had lots of different kinds of species. The original ones he wrote in the first edition were breathed in by the Creator. Darwin went to church every Sunday. He walked with his wife, a very religious Christian, to church every Sunday in their local parish. Okay? And he believed in God. He gradually began to not believe in God. We'll talk about that. He originally believed in God, right? And he believed that God made these basic forms, but then they evolved, just like you've got the laws of gravity, right? And planets, you have the laws of nature, right? And that's why when Darwin died, do you know where he got buried? Westminster Abbey. When Darwin was buried in Westminster Abbey a century ago, it was fitting that pallbearers, those who carried the coffin, included both clergymen and scientists, Torah and science. You've got priests and scientists. And they laid his body to rest near the grave of fellow scientist, creationist, Sir Isaac Newton. Also, an appropriate anthem was sung. Do you know what they sang? Right? Happy is the man that finds wisdom, and a man that gets understanding. She is a tree of life to them that lay hold on her. You know that. Eitz chaim hi lemachazikim ba. And happy is everyone who retains her. Yeah, we sing, we put the Torah back in the ark. It's a tree of life. The Lord by wisdom hath founded the earth. By understanding, he's established the heavens. Darwin's coffin was carried by priests and scientists, a unification of religion and science. That was the beliefs back then when he died in the 19th century, unified in his death. And Darwin never wanted to challenge religion, right? Look what he wrote to a friend. He said, I feel deeply that the whole subject is too profound for the human intellect. A dog might as well speculate on the mind of Newton. That's what he's saying when you speculate about how God made the world. He said, God to humans is like a human to a dog. Can a dog understand Sir Isaac Newton? Can a human being understand HaKadosh Baruch Hu? That's Darwin's metaphor. I love that because dog backwards is God. It's quite funny there, right? And look what he writes. And this, I think, is the motto of United Synagogue Jews. Let each man hope and believe what he can. Darwin wants to understand this, okay? How can he be atheistic? Look at him. He's got the hat, he's got the beard. It's fun, right? Let me show you more specifically this. This he wrote in Origin of Species. He wrote, I see no good reason why the views given in this volume should shock the religious feelings of anyone. He wasn't trying to wind people up. And then he says, a priest wrote to me and the following, and Darwin quotes this. He has gradually learned to see the following, and I hope you get this idea. It is just as noble a conception of God to believe that God created a few original forms capable of self-development into other forms as to believe that God required a fresh act of creation to supply the voids caused by the action of his laws. I'll say that again. What is a greater God? A God that has to make each species separately and make the Indian elephant and make the African elephant, and God makes every species separately, or a God that makes a few beings that can evolve into other ones? Rabbi Sachs, who we don't have anymore, in his wonderful book, The Great Partnership. I try to explain this for years. The genius man said it in one line. Learn this by heart. The Creator made creation creative. Again, the Creator made creation creative. One species evolves into another, or what we call in Hebrew, Rosh Gadol. When you run a business, do you want each person to just do exactly what they're told and not think for themselves? And you have to explain, no, do this, type this. You want them to think and grow. Only HaKadosh Baruch Hu could make beings, basic forms, that could evolve into others. I honestly believe this hand on heart. For me, that is a greater God than believing in a God that has to make each species separately. The God can make life, that the Creator can make life that's creative. That's Maaseh Hashem. When I look under a microscope at evolution, it helps me pray. It deepens my faith. Not only is it okay to visit the Natural History Museum, it's practically a mitzvah. And I say that because of the Rav knows, and Jacqueline in Hilchot Yesodei HaTorah, chapter 2, says, how do you learn to love God? By looking at God's amazing creations. You want to see them? Go to the Natural History Museum. Stand in front of that blue whale and look how bloody big it is, and not want to praise Kadosh Baruch Hu, Ma'abu Masech Hashem. It's amazing. That's what these things are. And that's what we realized from these ideas, right? Now some people said, but how can Darwin's ideas be religious? It involves random mutation. Remember that random thing that Darwin says? Creatures are born and they have random changes and that evolves? Is randomness anti-religious? No. Randomness is what HaKadosh Baruch Hu does for breakfast. The lot is cast in the lap. That's the lot. That's the dice are rolled, right? Mishpato me'Hashem. But how it lands is from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It looks random to us, but to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it's a plan. It's a system, infinitely complex. Rabbi Sachs always quoted that wonderful metaphor of the Persian rug. When you look underneath it, there's all these strings. You have no idea how they fit together. And you turn it over and you've got the most amazing pattern. So we're looking from one end and they're looking from the other, right? So it looks random, but actually it's got a huge pattern towards it. That's the connection of all life in the museum. That's how it all fits together. And that's one way of explaining things, right? Let me ask a question. When we say in the morning in davening, you know, that God makes light, and it says every morning God makes the sun come out. Do you believe that Hashem pushes the sun, or do you believe in Newton's laws of motion, that because of planetary gravitation, they move around? Most rabbis I know have no problem with gravitation. They've got no problem with people learning about attraction of planets and gravity. Fine. But the Torah, if you look at the poetry, it's as if God does it. Rambam says it's a metaphor. When it says God brings it out through the laws of astronomy. So here's the point. What Newton did for astronomy, Darwin did for biology. He explained how HaKadosh Baruch Hu did it. When you study astronomy and how gravitation works with planets, it is unbelievable. Do you know what happened tonight, by the way? Saturn and Jupiter overlapping, this great thing in the sky, which you've learned only happened maybe 500 years ago and happened in the year 7, and maybe they think that was the Star of Bethlehem and misunderstanding of planetary motion. When you learn the planets, you are humbled about the greatness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and how this world works. It's unbelievable that we're spinning so fast and the whole galaxy and everything. It's really inspiring. Right? No one has a problem religiously with astronomy. What did Newton do? He explained how HaKadosh Baruch Hu made the planets work. Darwin did it for biology. Now, the truth is, people say to you, Darwin wasn't religious, he didn't believe in God, right? And by the end, it's true, he didn't. You know why? Because his eldest daughter died of a horrific disease in her teenage years, and he was angry with God and couldn't believe in him anymore. How do I know? Because he wrote it in his diaries. And he would walk his wife to church every Sunday. But after his daughter died, she went in to pray, and he sat outside on the bench. And you know, we can understand that, being angry. But his challenge of faith was about what happened in his life, not about his science. And we get challenged by HaKadosh Baruch Hu with what happens to us, with this terrible coronavirus and who it takes, some great people, and what upsets us. But we can still believe and understand HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's the difference here. Now, I want to finish off with two final things, because I want to finish with a few time for questions at the end. We're going to look at creation of human beings, right? Human beings, are we also created by God? Really? Really? Or it says in Day 6 that God breathed life into us. Or did humans evolve as well? Can it really be? Let me quote to you the only ever Jewish British Prime Minister so far, right? Disraeli. What did he say? He'd heard about Darwin. He said, he stood up in Parliament, he said, "Is man an ape or an angel? I, my lord, am on the side of the angels, and I repudiate with indignation and abhorrence those newfangled theories." He completely rejected evolution. Of course we're like angels, Disraeli said, even though he wasn't from. Darwin said, no, there's no difference between man and the higher animals. It's one of degree, not of kind. So which is right? Well, let's look at creation, chapter 2. What does it say? God made humans dust of the earth, but also God breathed into this form that God had made, nostrils, the breath of life. And man came alive. So the first human is made from, God forms him from the earth and breathed into his nostrils. Now let me ask you a question. How did God breathe into Adam's nostrils? Do you think God has a mouth? Do you think God resuscitated Adam and blew in? Do you think God's got a mouth? No. Do you think this is literal? How long did it take when God breathed him in? Did it take 5 seconds? A week? How about 2 billion years? Maybe this is a way of describing a 2-stage evolution of humans. First, like all other animals, they were made, and gradually we gained consciousness. Not my idea. It's in the Ramban. We haven't got time to read it now, but the Ramban, traditional commentator, says that man is made on the same day as animals. If you want to highlight how different humans are to animals, why are they made on day 6 of creation? They're both on day 6. First, the only day where 2 species are made. First we have animals, then we have humans. So he says this soul being in addition to the form just mentioned. To finish off, let me quote you on that, a great Rav on this, Rav Gedalia Nadel, who was a Talmud of the Chazon Ish. What did he say? Regarding the basic point, right? He wrote this in his book called B'Soar Sharav Gedalia. I'm not going to say B'Torato because he was Ashkenazi. B'Soar Sharav Gedalia. He wrote this and he believed in it because my cousin Nathan Slifkin interviewed him. It's on tape and he said, I believe this. And he said the following: regarding the basic point that the creation of man in the image of God was the conclusion of a lengthy process which began in a non-rational being under the category of animals that process to develop until it acquired human intellect and also the physiological appearance of man, with which we are familiar, it is reasonable that this is a correct assumption. The evidence of Darwin and the paleontologists regarding the existence of early stages appears convincing. In which case, where's HaKadosh Baruch Hu? So then he tells us, as long as there's recognition of the divine will that functions in nature via spiritual forces, there's no need whatsoever to negate the description of events that science explains. There are disguises of skeletons of two-legged beings with a small skull whose brain could not have been the brain of human beings that we know. The man with which we say, let us make man in our image, was the final stage of a gradual process. He had no problem, just like Chief Rabbi Hertz says, as long as you say HaKadosh Baruch Hu started the process, the creator made creation, there are no problems. Science doesn't take us away from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. With the right kavanah, with the right belief, it deepens it. I love visiting the Natural History Museum. When I daven Shachrit on the day I'm about to go to there, I'm excited. I'm going to see Ma'aseh Hashem, how God did it. When you understand it, it deepens your understanding, your beliefs. And therefore, let's finish with Rav Gedalia, right? With the Mishnah says that the world was created with 10 statements, okay? And it says, why did God make, because God says the word Vayomer 10 times in creation. Why 10 times? Right? What does it teach us? Surely it could have created with one utterance, rather, Ella, to exact punishment on the wicked who destroy the world by speaking negatively in 10 different ways. So the purpose of creation is to teach us not the biology, but the morality of how to live. Look what Rav Gedalia wrote. With 10 utterances, the world was created. Right? That is to say, see what a beautiful and sophisticated world was created, prepared for you, man, the pinnacle of creation. And take care you do not destroy it. How do we destroy the world? The Torah tells us, this is the Torah. God made a beautiful world for us and says, don't muck it up. Right? So chapter 1, create a beautiful world. And then God says, well, do you want to not muck it up? Be the Torah. And the Torah, as you know, is a moral guidebook of how to live a moral life. It teaches us how to live on planet Earth sensibly and meaningfully. And now let's go back to the Natural History Museum. And instead of looking at Dippy in the middle, he's on tour now. He's been replaced. Do you know what's there now? Let me show you what's there now. Let's see if I can find it. Here we go. Let me reveal to you. Dippy magically has gone. Right? This is what the museum looks like today. He's gone. Look, he's gone. There's nothing here. What's here? There's a new exhibit they put up. You got to look up. You ready? Here it is. Looking up, looking up. Can you see what it is yet? Can you see? All right, try and look at it over here. Okay. Let me take you out a bit and we can see more clearly. It is a blue whale. And when you stand underneath it, it's as if it's going into you. Let's go over here and we can see more clearly. If I turn around now, you can see it from the front. It's a blue whale hanging. There's two reasons. One, it means more people can stand in the foyer, and they now rent it out for bar mitzvahs. If you've got £17,000 spare, you can have your bar mitzvah in the floor over here, right? But the reason it's done like that now is they've changed it, right? They put the whale in the middle. Why? Because the Natural History Museum, and I promise you this is true, is no longer just about the past. It's also about protection of species. So instead of looking at the past and dinosaurs, they're now looking at the future. And the future is about preserving life. The moral dimension of the museum is now its central concern. Isn't that amazing? The moral dimension, just like in our Torah. And that's why if I end my hand out, I can show you, do you know what they named it? They named it Hope. That's what it's called, right? The national anthem of the Jewish people is called Hatikva. And the main exhibit in the center of the Natural History Museum is called Hope. The hope that human beings will live in harmony with nature in the future, that we won't waste it. They'll protect it. We won't destroy it for no reason. Jewishly, we don't. Baltashke, we don't waste it. We'll look after the creatures and not allow more extinctions and respect the great earth that God has made us, to appreciate it and to look after it and to care for it. That's the modern moral message of the Natural History Museum. Should a Jew feel comfortable here? Absolutely. It was built by people who believed in God. The vision of its organizers now is about moral responsibility for our planet. That is the true religious story of the Natural History Museum in London. Thank you very much. Now, I'm happy to take questions. If people want to unmute or maybe write in the chat, then I will happily answer your questions. Claude, asked about why does the Torah say the world is thousands of years old then? So many have argued that the Torah is telling a story. You can take Adam and Eve literally if you want. Others say Adam and Eve is about when human beings, not Homo sapiens, are made, but when they start actually being involved in industry and development of life. That's what the Torah is going back into. Okay. I was once asked a great question. I rather love this. Why is a marriage contract accurate? Because every marriage contract, ketubah, says in the year 5780, 5781. And if I believe the world is millions of years old, Raphy, are you saying that all marriage contracts are null and void and the dating is wrong? And I didn't know the answer to that for a bit, and I thought about it, and then I looked at the contract. You know what it says? Love, what does it say in the line? V'shanat zeh ka'asher. What it says? It's what's the phrase? I've got it in my thing. Kamosher monim, according to our counting. If you look at your ketubah, it's got the phrase, the year 5780, according to how we count. The rabbis admit that counting time is subjective. All counting of time is subjective. Because only HaKadosh Baruch Hu was there at the very beginning. We humans, we might measure time through rings in trees, through how humans get older, the year of the king, the year we count back to when Adam and Eve are described, but it's all subjective. Only HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows the true measure of all time. So the rabbis write in a ketubah the year according to our time. You know, when you write the year 2020, according to the year Anno Domini, the year of our Lord. Well, our Lord is not our Lord, right? Our Lord is Jesus. Yoski, that's not our Lord. We don't write that. My religious Zionist cousins in Israel, by the way, you're like this, Ralph. They're very religious Zionists. They refuse to write a check and put an English date on it. They write Kislev 578, and they take it to the bank, and the bank goes, "What is this?" He goes, "And by Jewish law in Israel, you have to accept a check written with the Jewish date on it." He's a real Zionist, right? It's not Gideon, it's the other side, my wife's side. And he hands the check and he goes, "Right, you've got to accept this," okay? But all dating is subjective. So I don't mind 2020, 5080. We're just trying to work out time when things were relative to each other. But only a Kodesh Baruch Hu knows accurate time. So I've got no problem with time measures. So it's completely fine by me. Right, let's look at the chat. Are you sure Dippy is on tour? You did allude to Americans taking bits, so maybe you should check Rabbi Chanan's house. I won't answer that. But no, he's definitely on tour. He's definitely on tour. But who knows what's in the Ralph's house? Fascinating talk. Thank you very much. Interesting, fascinating, shkoyach, all good things. Great, excellent. Any other questions? Here's your chance to ask any questions about the Natural History Museum. There's lots of wonderful things. Shall I show you a funny cartoon along the way? You'll like this. There we go. I've got these little cartoons at the end. I've got lots of books you can read. But over here, yeah, look at this. See if I can rotate this. Can I rotate? How do I rotate? Don't know how to do that. Oh, rotate clockwise. That's useful. Rotate again. Rotate again. Here we go. Okay. These are books about evolution. Okay. So here you have the evolution of man. And Jacqueline, I thought you might like this. And here's the evolution of woman. Right. This is different theories about evolution. Okay. Here's one. Right. A place in history. World terrorist parachutes into appropriate place. Okay. This is a cynical attack about terrorists and how they're kind of Neanderthal. Or people who believe this is about creationists. Right. And my favorite one, which I don't think the Rav and Repson will get. I know, Jacqueline, you might. Do you remember Granada Television radio rentals? This is the evolution of man to buying DVDs and videos, right? There's all these different theories about how evolution works, okay? But I've got some other deeper ideas I could talk about, but I think we'll end there. Lots of fun stuff about how evolution works, right? But I wanted to show you that, don't be afraid of these things, right? Initially, Rabbi Sachs says people get afraid of science and they think, oh, it clashes with things. That's why he called his book The Great Partnership. What's the partnership? Torah and science. Right? They must agree, he says, because it all unifies. He says, science takes things apart to see how they work, and religion, Torah, puts things together to see what they mean. And you shouldn't feel they're a contradiction. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Dr. Zarum. This has been such an incredible evening. As a scientist, one of my favorite things is to show how science really is there to teach us more about Marabu Masecha Hashem, how incredible everything that Hashem does is. And your talk has just been all about that. I can't wait for us to be able to visit the museum with you in person, please God, soon. And really thank you for a wonderful evening, and thank you everyone for being with us together tonight. Thank you to our educational team for putting this all together, and just a big shkoyach, Rabbi Raphy.
You're welcome. I'll tell you one little thing my daughter said to me when she was like 6. She goes, Abba, I know that dragons aren't real. Okay, I know that. I've worked that out. Okay, I know that elephants are real because I've seen them when we went to Africa and everything. He goes, I promise she said this, 6. She goes, Abba, I'm not sure about hedgehogs. I said, what do you mean? She goes, do they really exist with a spike? Because you've never seen one, and it was such a crazy idea. It's got and how does it, you know, walk? How does it live? What does it bump? How does it reproduce? So a kid, she's like, she knows magical things and she knows real things, but Jacqueline, God's creation is so complicated. You think, could it really be a thing that's real? And hedgehogs are real. How do hedgehogs reproduce? Right? How does that work? Right? So we have to. When you study biology, you discover wonderful things about Maaseh Hashem.
And Rabbi Raphy, next time you come visit our house, there's a hedgehog on our doorstep, because our daughter Malka calls Elchanan a hedgehog because of his prickly beard. So hedgehogs are very dear to our family.
Okay. I've got one final joke to make you smile, which Simon Goulden told me in the shul, which is very relevant to the time of the year. Okay, with Christmas Eve on Thursday night. It's basically a picture of saying,
take your pill.
You heard this one, Rabbi? What else could go wrong in 2020? And it shows Joseph coming out from Mary and saying, "It's a girl."
Yeah, I saw that.
You see that one?
Yeah,
So
Rabbi Raphy, everyone's very concerned that you shouldn't forget to take your pills.
Oh, good. Thank you. Thank you. I'm taking my pills. Good. Thank you so much. Because it's on my phone at 9 a.m., 9 p.m. So thank you. I would have forgotten. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you very much. Everyone have a safe drive home.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Wonderful,
Visit the museum.
wonderful evening.
We'll see you
Thank
soon.
you.
Lovely
Really,
film and see you
really
soon.
special.
Good night.
Good night.